We're in Acts chapter 24, and continuing with verse 22, and it says, "And when Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them and said, When Lysias, the chief captain, shall come down, I will know the uttermost of your matter. And he commanded a centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and that he should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or come unto him." Now, we remember the background of this. The Jews have come down from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and they're accusing, accusing Paul before Felix, and Felix now has made a decision. Now, notice that he says, or imagine rather, if first of all you were Tertullus and these Jews, and you hear what Felix has just said. I think I would be disappointed, wouldn't you? Maybe I would be angry that he didn't give us what we wanted. And there's little doubt in my mind that what they wanted was for Paul to be murdered. Because we're going to see later on with regard to Festus that they tried to get Festus to bring Paul down to Jerusalem. Why? To try to do what they did or tried to do before in laying ambush for Paul and to kill him. So I have no doubt that they wanted Felix to have him put to death. Notice that Felix heard both sides. I have to give him credit for this. This was an extremely evil man. He's going to be recalled to Rome. He's going to have to stand trial before Nero, and he's going to be banished because he was so evil and caused so many problems in the Judean area. But notice it says the word carries, or rather the word heard, is auo, and that word means to understand. It's not just a peripheral knowledge, it's a full understanding of what has been presented to him. And that's interesting because it tells us that he had a firm grasp of the arguments that were being presented, the issues that were before him. He would have to have had a firm grasp of Jewish law. So, and notice second of all, that this isn't the first time that Felix had heard of the way. He couldn't have had this full knowledge. He couldn't have had this full grasp of the issues and the arguments if he had not had knowledge of the way. Of course, the way is Christianity. It's not talking about the way to San Jose or California. Why would anyone want to go there anyway? But that's another matter. But it's talking about the full knowledge of Christianity. He had a pretty good knowledge. I'm sure he didn't have a total knowledge, like say maybe the apostles did or those. But it says he had a more perfect knowledge, a more exact, a more perfect, a more complete knowledge. It's possible that these Jews didn't think he knew anything about their religion, or very little, or maybe didn't care and had never investigated, but apparently he had. His knowledge, again, was not peripheral. It was more in depth. Now, notice Felix's wife, a woman named Drusilla. Drusilla was a Jewess, and there's very good reason to believe that she had a very good knowledge of Judaism, the law of Moses. Now, notice the third thing. Felix deferred them. What does that mean? Campbell's translation of this says he put them off. Luttrell's translation of this said he adjourned the trial. The English Standard Version says he put them off, and the New King James says he delayed them. Does that bring any thoughts to your mind? He put them off. He had a more perfect knowledge. He had a more complete knowledge of this way, the Christianity and Judaism, probably because of his wife Drusilla. It seems that the evidence was pretty straightforward, and yet he didn't want to make a judgment. Wonder why? We're going to see part of the reason later on. So why delay this verdict? The fourth thing that we notice about Felix is that he's going to wait to give his verdict until Lysias, the chief captain, came up and reported to him. That doesn't make sense. Well, you say, well, Bob, why doesn't it make sense to you? Well, Felix had the authority to render a judgment. He could have put Paul to death, or, well, he could have tried. He wouldn't have succeeded. Or he could have released him. He had Lysias had written a report to him. And in that report, he gave the conclusion. Paul hasn't done anything worthy of death, neither to the Jews or to Rome. He hadn't broken any law that would require death. And when you look at the context, there's no evidence that Lysias ever went down to Caesarea from Jerusalem and reported to Felix on this matter. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It could have. But it's not reported to us. Note the provisions of Paul's incarceration. First of all, Paul was given liberty. What does that mean? He obviously wasn't allowed to just go anywhere he wanted to. Is it possible that this is like what we see in Genesis chapter 39? You remember Joseph had been cast into prison because Mrs. Potiphar had issued a false charge against him that he tried to rape her, basically, is what she said. And so her husband, even though the evidence shows us in that chapter that he liked Joseph and seems to have had an idea that maybe he hadn't done this, but the jailer, the prison keeper, had given Joseph liberty in that it appears that he had the run of the prison. He could go anywhere in there. He was charged with taking care of the prisoners, and you had to have some amount of freedom in order to do that. So I kind of think this is probably what we see with Paul here when it talks about he was given liberty. Second, we notice that none of Paul's friends were denied access to him, and nor were they prevented from helping him. They weren't denied. There was no restriction put on taking care of him or visiting him. And so what did this allow Paul to do? It allowed him to continue to teach and send messages that he may have needed to brethren, etc. But there's also something else involved here. Since he's a prisoner, the prisoners are going to be able to hear him speak, and the guards are going to be able to hear him speak. And we'll notice something later on that this was something very important later on when he's in prison in Rome. Now, it's considered here, by me at least, that Felix had no backbone. He didn't have any backbone. He wasn't willing to stand up to the Jews and say, look, this is a bunch of phony charges you've brought against him. Get out of my court. Nor did he have a backbone to say, now I know what justice demands and that's what I'm going to do. Paul, you're free to go. He knew Paul was innocent of all charges. Let's look at verse 24 and 25. And after certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, Go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. Notice that Felix could just as easily have ordered him killed or released. You remember Herod had killed John, hadn't he, for preaching the truth. And at least he could have tried to kill Paul. Now, you and I know from the context that he couldn't have if he wanted to, because God had plans for Paul. And we've noticed in past lessons that Felix, again, was one of the most evil rulers to ever rule over the province of Judea. And Drusilla was every bit as evil and filled with debauchery as was Felix. The time frame in this context, Josephus in his Antiquities mentions to us that at this time that Paul is imprisoned, this 2 years, that she was only 20 years old. Other writers say that she was 22 at this time. She had been married to another king of another area, and she left him for Felix. She deserted her husband. And so MacArthur stated that she wasn't yet 20 years old at this time. Others, 22, and Josephus said 20. Now, let's remember who Drusilla's father was. It was Herod Agrippa. And again, Herod Agrippa was very evil in himself. He had James murdered in Acts chapter 12 simply because he taught the gospel, the Apostle James. He put the Apostle Paul in prison, intending to murder him as well because he knew it would please the Jews, Acts chapter 12 and verse 1. And finally, we see Agrippa eaten by worms. Think about how horrible a death that would be. And it wasn't something that was quick. You know, when we read our New Testament, we read it and it almost appears like, oh, he was smitten by worms and he died immediately. No. Josephus, again, gives us information on this. They were just slowly eating his body up from the inside out. It would have been a horrible death. Well, why was he stricken with these worms? Well, remember, he had a complaint against some of those under his rule, and he went to them and he gave an oration. And they started claiming, oh, he's a god, he's a god. And apparently he didn't deny it. Apparently he accepted their false worship that was going on at that time, their false acclamations about him. That's Acts 12 and verse 23. And when we study the Herodian family as a whole, they were people who swapped wives about as often as a man swaps shoes. They were horrible people. Herod the Great was ordered that a whole bunch of officials in his time, when he knew he was getting close to death, he gathered them all together and said, when I die, you murder them all, because he knew that no one was going to mourn his death, so he wanted there to be mourning in the streets. Thankfully, those who were charged with doing that did not do it. So we're looking at a family, even with Drusilla, just a horrible family. Now, Felix and Drusilla, they send for Paul. They said, we want to listen to you concerning the faith. We want to hear what you have to say. Well, what did he hear? Well, first of all, he heard doctrine concerning the faith. The doctrine of the Messiah, the Christ, the one who had come. This would have included all that you and I have with regard to him, the Christ, in our New Testaments. And Felix and Drusilla, we need to remember they were not listening to a wishy-washy preacher. Now, what do I mean by a wishy-washy preacher? That's a preacher that sticks his finger up in the air, wets it, and which way is the wind of popularity blowing? No, that's not like Drusilla or Paul. Paul wasn't the kind of person that because he was under threat of some dire punishment, that he's going to back off. He's going to teach the truth. And notice the Bible says that he reasoned with them. This word, Strong tells us, means to say thoroughly. In other words, he didn't leave anything out that they needed. He would have probably done exactly, and probably did do exactly in all of these conversations, especially this particular one, done the same thing that John had done. You don't have a right to be married to each other. You've broken God's law. Thayer tells us that this word means to converse, to discourse with a person, to argue with, to discuss. And all of these things would have been involved in his talking to them and telling them about the way, the faith, the Christ. So what did Paul reason with them about? First of all, the text says righteousness. That is, in a simple way, that's doing what God says to do. That's what righteousness is, doing what God tells a person to do. It's not determining for himself what is right or wrong. Only God can do that. Man, when he starts delving into those areas of determining for himself what is right or wrong, almost always he gets himself in trouble. Almost always he takes the wrong path. Only God really has the right to determine what is right and what is wrong, how we live. He also talked to them about temperance, self-control. Today in our society, the word temperance has the connotation many times of, it's talking about alcohol and be temperate in the use of alcohol. But the word temperate originally means to be self-controlled in any area, every area of our life. And again, we can't be self-controlled unless we're willing to sacrifice our own thinking for the thinking of God, to do what God says is right. We have to learn to master our desires, our passions, and whatever carnal appetites that we might have for whatever it is. It can be eating too much. It can be of a sexual nature. Anything can be delved into too much, our carnal appetites. And then he reasoned with them with regard to judgment to come. I can't help but think, man, he had to have a lot to talk to these two about. I mean, they were so evil. We're going to see later that, Felix wanted bribes. What was the result then of Paul's reasoning of these things with Felix and Drusilla? We see the reaction of Felix, but we don't see the reaction of Drusilla. The Bible says Felix trembled. This diabolical, I can do anything I want to, nobody can stop me, I don't have any consequences for what I do. The word used is emphobos. And what that means is he was terrified. Imagine that. Here's this guy who thinks, nobody can do anything to me. I'll do whatever I want. I'll do whatever I please. But when Paul reasoned with him of temperance and judgment to come, etc., it terrified him. But again, nothing said about Drusilla's reaction. Was she maybe like Herodias, who seems to have had the idea of, how dare you tell me that I'm sinning? How dare you tell me that I can't be married to this man? We don't know how Drusilla reacted, but we do know how Felix reacted. And if Drusilla acted in that way, how dare you? Doesn't that sound like people today? The majority of people in our day, if we tell them, the Bible says that you're sinning, how do they react? Notice another thing about Felix here. He procrastinated. Go thy way for this time. He was terrified by what he heard, and yet, I'll maybe call you at another time. Maybe I'll talk to you at some more convenient time. Or was he basically saying, I'm terrified at what you just told me, and I know that I need to make some changes, but maybe at some other convenient time? He temporarily got rid of the thorn in his conscience. And by doing that, what he did was allow his conscience to become more hardened than it had been before. Roper made a comment that I thought was really good here. He said that it is never convenient. Think about what he said here. It is never convenient to change a sinful lifestyle, to give up a lucrative position, and put away a beautiful wife. I think he summed it up pretty well, don't you? That's an interesting way to think about this. Felix didn't want to change, so he put Paul off. Look at verse 26 and 27. He hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul, that he might loose him. Wherefore he sent for him the oftener and communed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. Here's that old ugly side of Felix coming out. He wants some money. He wants a bribe. Why would he think that possibly he could even get a bribe? Well, remember what Tertullius said? He said Paul was the ringleader of these Nazarenes. Well, if you're the ringleader, that makes you kind of important, doesn't it, in that particular group, whatever it is? And if you're important, why, surely maybe the people, I maybe might have reasoned that if I was like Felix, that maybe, they'll do something to make sure that I get a bribe and I'll let Paul go. It was not unusual in that time for ransoms to be paid. Now, he's not asking for a ransom. He's asking for a bribe. But it wasn't unusual in that time for ransoms to be paid for someone who was important, who had been captured in war, and let it be known to the enemy that, hey, we got your king here, for them to pay a ransom to have him released. But again, I want to emphasize that Felix is not asking for a ransom. He's asking for a bribe. Felix, under Roman law, if you took a bribe as an official in the Roman Empire, you would be exiled, and the confiscation of your property, your bribes especially, would be taken away. But in the provinces, if that'd been done in Rome, as soon as the word got out that he was accepting bribes, there would have been a trial and he would have been condemned. But in the provinces, they were a little more lax in this and didn't enforce it so much. What it's going to take to get Felix before Nero is the Jews are going to complain to Rome, to Nero and his court, about Felix and the bribes that he was taking, the injustices that he was performing, and thievery and murders and all of these things that he was involved in. So Felix, what did he do? He's hoping for a bribe, so he sends for Paul more often. And he communed with him. He spoke with him. I would suggest that at the very best, Felix was communing with Paul on an intellectual pursuit. He wasn't after a moral pursuit. He wasn't listening to Paul to try to learn what he should do. He'd already had an opportunity and he turned his back on it. He had an opportunity already where he was scared to death. He was terrified. He didn't accept it then. And again, notice how in our context, it's talking about that bribe, and that's why he sent for him. Keep him ever before his mind, and knowing that people are coming to him and that he can tell them that he's been talking with Felix, etc. But a change of regime came in. Felix was replaced by Porcius Festus. And Festus is going to die 2 years after assuming the governorship of Judea. And this is going to fit right about the time when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. Felix's corruption, you see, caught up with him. You can't be as corrupt as he was without sooner or later it coming back to roost. Felix's last act as governor, though, is again an evil. What does he do? He says, I'm going to leave Paul in prison. And apparently he let the Jews know, I'm going to do this as a favor to you. Maybe he was hoping that they would send word to Nero, because he now, remember, has been summoned back to Rome to stand trial for all of his evil deeds. Notice a few final notes about Felix. The trial didn't go very well for Felix in Rome. He was banished to Gaul, what we call France today, and where he finally died. And Drusilla, what happened to her? Josephus in his Antiquities said that Drusilla and their son, Felix and her son, died in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Now, I've often wondered how he knew for sure that they died. Maybe they lived a little bit on the outskirts and were overcome by the noxious gases or whatever. I don't know. But he reports that Drusilla and her son, after her husband Felix died in Gaul, that she moved to Pompeii and died when the volcano erupted. Sometimes we know Josephus got it wrong, but I can't help but wonder how he knew that absolutely, where he would write it in his Antiquities. Let's look at chapter 25 and verses 1 through 3. Now when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. And then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him and desired favor against him, that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. Festus arrives in Caesarea to assume his new position, and 3 days after he arrives there, he goes up to. Notice the scriptures, how they keep telling us that they descended from Jerusalem to Caesarea, they ascended they descended from Jerusalem to Caesarea, they ascended, and keeps telling us over and over that there's this elevation difference. But it was common in those times for a new ruler to visit the chief cities in his new district. Obviously, Jerusalem would be probably the chiefest city in the whole district. Maybe only second to Caesarea, and maybe even greater than Caesarea. We don't know exactly how that ranking was. So he goes up to Jerusalem, and there he meets with the new high priest. You say, what? New high priest? What happened to Ananias? Ananias had been assassinated. Ishmael was the new high priest when Festus went up to Jerusalem. Unfortunately, this high priest, Ishmael, was no better than Ananias. He was just as evil. Remember, Ananias was willing to kill people to maintain his power. He took bribes. He robbed even his own priest. This is an evil man. And to say that Ishmael was no better than Ananias is saying a lot about Ananias and Ishmael, isn't it? Now consider these Jewish leaders' hatred for Paul. It's being revealed to us again, just as it had been earlier. Paul had now been a prisoner of Rome for 2 years. He's out of sight. He can't do anything, at least they say he can't, but they still want him dead. They don't just want him out of sight. They don't just want him in a position where he can write some letters, although written words are far more powerful than spoken words. They want him dead. And so they get a new plot. And notice who's involved in this? The chief Jews. This new high priest. That's interesting to me because before it was 40 plus men who developed the plot. Now it's the Jewish Sanhedrin itself. And they want this new governor. Bring him down. Bring him down to Jerusalem. Call for him. Get him down here. But they didn't want him for a trial. They planned on ambushing him while he's in transit. Kill him. Truly, the Jewish nation under the Sanhedrin and the Jewish priest of their day became so evil that they deserved the destruction that was about to fall on them and fall on their nation. Jerusalem would be destroyed. Jesus' prediction that the temple would not have one stone left standing upon another was going to take place in just a couple of years. The destruction of all of the records of the Jewish priesthood, which effectively destroyed Judaism. Anybody who says they practice Judaism today, they're not telling the truth. They can't. They can't have a priesthood. And under the Mosaic law, they had to have a priesthood. Consider the difference in the plan to murder. 40 men plus. We're not going to eat a thing. They didn't make this kind of a vow. We're just going to set up an ambush and we're going to kill him. And consider this. Just like the 40 plus men, if they had succeeded in doing what they wanted to do, just like them, it would probably have started a war they couldn't win. Let's look at verses 4 and 5. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me, and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. Was Festus only now being apprised of Paul's situation? I doubt it. I doubt it very seriously. He seems like a pretty competent person as far as willing to do what the law required him to do. Doesn't mean he wasn't evil. But Festus could have easily sent for Paul. I mean, he had the authority to do so. Well, so why didn't he? Again, I want to refer to Roper. He made this comment about Festus. He said, Festus may not have been aware of the Jews' plot, but he knew a power play when he saw it. He understood what was going on as far as a power play. He'd been involved in politics for a long time. The Jewish leaders, he continued, were trying to take advantage of the inexperience of a new ruler who had a natural desire to get his regime off to a good start. I think he's probably right in that. A much simpler reason, though, in my estimation, is the providence of God. And God's not going to let Paul go back down to Jerusalem. He's not going to let Paul have to suffer, or these soldiers who would be guarding him suffer when they beat back those who tried to assassinate Paul. Instead, Festus invited the Jewish leaders to come down to Jerusalem or to Caesarea and to go with him as he traveled and bring your charges against Paul. I don't think Festus was a dummy at all. I think he knew something about this whole situation. Maybe he had taken the time to read a few of the reports about this area. That would be a natural thing for a Roman leader to do. I don't know what it was, but again, I think it's probably more the providence of God than anything. Our time is almost up. Let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll come back with verse 6 and 7 next week.